start talking about the 1950s, specifically kind of like what's going on in America, what's dictating life during the 1950s politically and economically and socially. But like most things during this time, in order to understand the 1950s, we have to go back actually to World War II and understand how does the experiences of World War II affect how Americans live their daily lives during the 1950s. Because remember, World War II ends in 1945, and then we go into the beginning of the Cold War, which we talked about last week. And the Cold War is really focused outside of the United States because it's the United States and the Soviet Union, which involves, like, again, Korea and the arms race, in Berlin and Germany. And we talked about all these different places where the Cold War is kind of playing out. We talked a little bit about the U.S. at home in the Cold War, and we talked about McCarthy. But all of that stuff is happening largely during the 1950s, and so we want to figure out what is going on at home in the U.S. during this decade when all this craziness is going on around the world in terms of the Cold War. Okay, so again, we got to go back to World War II to understand it, and it really does all kind of come down to like all of that craziness. After World War II, Americans largely just want things to be okay. They want to create what they call an ideal society. And again, if we look at this in the context of World War II, it kind of makes sense because during World War II, everything is different, right? You have all of these men, young and old, who leave and go overseas and they start fighting the war. You have women for the very first time, and we talked about this, who are going into all these different roles. Maybe they have a new job, maybe they're working in a factory, maybe they're in the military themselves and they've been overseas. You have kids now who have started going to daycare and preschools. So you just have all of this newness in terms of American society and how they're living their day-to-day life, that when all of these men come home from the war, right, after they've been fighting overseas, there's kind of this collective, like, let's just go back to normal and try to make it better than ever, okay? So they look at like the chaos and the destruction of World War II, and they react to that by saying, we want to create something better, okay? So the question becomes, what is better to them, okay? And during this time, during the 1950s, better means consistency, something we can rely on. Because again, World War II was largely chaotic, right? Everything was different. It was changing. You didn't know who was going to win. You're fighting Hitler. You're fighting Japan. There were surprise attacks all over the place. And so they can't rely on anything. So after that war ends, they largely want society to be a place where they can create consistency and kind of conformity, and they can therefore rely on it, okay, if that makes sense. And so the question becomes, where does that begin? How do you create consistency and stability in your society? Well, a lot of sociologists, this is actually a pretty common thought, is you have to get down to the most minute or smallest level, like the very beginning of your society. If you want to affect the whole thing, you got to go to the smallest part first and then work and build your way up. And so the smallest part of a society would be the family unit, because if you think about our society, you have lots of families made up in its entirety. So you build on that. You start with the family, and then you go to neighborhood, right? And then you go to city, then you go to county, then you go to state, and then you go to, region of the United States, like west, east, north, south, and then you go to the entire US. So if you want to fix the whole US, right, in terms of society, you have to go scale down until you get to the family, okay? So Americans in the 1950s become obsessed with fixing the family to affect everything else, okay? And the focus is largely on the nuclear family. So there's two different types of like designations for a family. There's nuclear and extended, okay? Extended would be everybody in your family. So grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody, okay? Like everybody you see in Thanksgiving and Christmas, okay? But nuclear family are the people that you see largely to the day-to-day, right? Mom, dad, kids. That's the nuclear family, okay? So we have extended and we have nuclear. During the 1950s, Americans are obsessed with this idea of fixing the nuclear family. So what are the roles of mom, dad, and the kids, okay? And the idea becomes that if we can give everybody a job, right? If dad has a job, if mom has a job, if the kids have a job, and if they do their jobs really well within that nuclear family, they're going to create a perfect family. And if you have lots of perfect families, you have perfect neighborhoods, you have perfect cities, you have perfect counties, and so on and so forth until you get perfect society as a whole. Okay, so the focus becomes on giving everybody a specific job and role within that nuclear family. Okay, and so in order to do that, you have to communicate to people what is their role, right? Like people don't just wake up and say, oh, my new role is this, right? So how does the government, how does society at large communicate to mom, communicate to dad, communicate to kids? What is my role within the family? And they largely do that through the culture. Okay, so everybody has an assigned role, and American culture is showing them that through largely television. Okay, we haven't talked a lot about TV, but TV is invented in the 1950s, and most Americans are owning a TV set by the end of the decade. And so kids are watching shows, mom and dad are watching shows, and in the shows that they watch, the families act a certain way. So the mom acts a certain way, the dad acts a certain way, the kids act a certain way. And what we see on TV affects the way that we live, right? Kind of that idea of like what I see is what I do. And so by modeling perfection on TV or in movies or in books and literature, all these forms of culture are communicating the same roles. Americans internalize that and they start acting that way, okay? One of the best examples of this is the show Leave It to Beaver. If you've ever seen it, you may have heard of it. It's an old 1950s black and white show. It was super popular. The dad comes home after the long day in the suit. He drops the briefcase off. He sits in the chair and he sits there, right? Mom is ready to greet him at the door with the kiss. She's got the pearls. She's been home all day. She's been vacuuming and cleaning in the pearls in the dress. And then when dad comes home, she's super excited to see him. She brings him dinner. Like that's mom and Leave It to Beaver, okay? Kids, super like groomed, like short haircuts, and the girls have like their hair all done up. They're wearing like the dresses and the socks, their shirts are tucked in, they're super clean, really good at school. Hi, mom and dad, so happy to see you. I love you so much. Perfection, right? And so those types of shows communicated to American families, this is what, you should be acting like. So in this lecture, I want to go through each of those different roles and kind of show you what was expected, what were the stereotypes that were communicated to Americans to create, again, this ideal family, okay? So in terms of men and women, the dad, he was the provider. So he was the one that worked. He was expected to bring in all the money. We call that the breadwinner. So he went to work and he provided all of the family's money, okay? And men were expected to make the major decisions in the family. Okay, because he made the money and he was the breadwinner, he largely dictated or decided what the family did with the money and what major life decisions they were making. So where they lived, what his job was, where the kids went to school, a lot of those decisions were left up to dad because he was the head of the home. Okay, in terms of women in society, they were largely expected to stay home. And if you remember World War II, these women are working in all these different new arenas and they're excited about it. They have new jobs and skills. And so you can imagine when World War II ends and culture and society is saying, okay, time to go home and put on the pearls and vacuum, a lot of them are really upset about that, like internally. They do it, but they're bitter inside. And that's going to give way to the 1960s feminist movement, which we alluded to a couple of weeks ago, but we'll have a lecture on that in a couple of weeks. But women are called to care for the kids at home. Anything that has to do with children, it's the mom's job. Anything that has to do with the home is the mom's job. But again, they're coming home from the workplace after World War II. And a lot of them are not quite sure how they feel about that, okay? In terms of children, this is probably the biggest difference because mom and dad were always expected to kind of do those things, but with the kids, this is really different. And so family life in the 50s, it revolves around the children, okay? How can we give children a childhood? This is the first time we even hear about like childhood in America. Because up until this point, like kids worked, right? Kids were like on the farm or kids were like in the factory, and we have child labor laws and advocates and all this stuff. And so this is the first time where Americans across the country are saying, no, kids should have a childhood. And a lot of that is because of a new book called Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care by Dr. Benjamin Spock. Definitely a book that you want to know. It revolutionizes America because it says that kids are distinct. They're not like adults. They're distinct. There are distinct areas and phases of childhood development, and we should care for children differently at different stages of their life. Okay, and so this opens up a whole new science called child development, and it's basically saying that babies are different than toddlers, than preschoolers, than young children, than teenagers, than young adults, and then full-grown adults, where everyone before was kind of lumped into the same thing, like we're humans. Now we see these distinct phases of life, and you treat children differently in those stages. Okay, and so again, mom exists to know about her kids and to know about these different stages, and to again be able to understand her kids at different phases of life. Children are expected to go to school. They're expected to come home and then maybe do homework, but not do real work, because again, the emphasis is on them having a childhood. And so when your kids get home, mom does work, right? She's in charge of the home, but kids go and play. Okay, kids go have fun with their friends. They go to the movies. They go do different things with other kids. Okay, so for the first time, kids have more freedom, and they're expected to kind of enjoy this new childhood. And that brings about all these new television shows that are geared toward children. A bunch of the Disney movies that you guys grew up on, Snow White, Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty, all of those classics made during the 1950s and 60s for American children who are now expected to watch those shows. Lone Ranger, Mickey Mouse Club, again, Leave It to Beaver, Looney Tunes, all come out in the 50s and 60s because now kids are watching kid shows. All kinds of new toys too. This is when Barbie comes out, G.I. Joe, Potato Head, the hula hoop, Silly Putty, the Slinky, all those classic toys that maybe you played with. Those are new in the 50s and 60s because for the first time, kids aren't expected to work. They're expected to play and watch TV and just have fun. This also brings about a whole new group called the teenager, which you guys know something about. I think the 50s brings about kind of, again, these new stages of development, and one of those is the teenager. Now, before, you went from kid to adult. And teenager is now a new thing. And so there's this idea that teenagers, this age group, they have kind of a different set of needs, a different set of experiences. They deal with relationships differently. They learn to drive. They have different emotional needs. Like all these different needs are different to teenagers, specific to teenagers, and therefore we should treat them differently. And again, this is a way different way of thinking, because before, teenagers, they worked or they were fighting in World War II. So they were treated like adults, but for the first time, teenagers are expected to finish high school, for instance, and even go on to college. So you have all of these new ideas concerning this age group. And again, that gives way to culture. Just like we saw young children, they had their own toys and they had their own TV shows and things like that. Teenagers spark a whole new culture in America, which you still largely enjoy today. So music becomes geared towards teenagers, like the beginning of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, the Beach Boys, some of those 50s and 60s bands, the Beatles. That music was not to appeal to young children or even to adults. It was for teenagers, okay? Different movies and television shows, they're depicting teenagers and the issues that you guys go through. So shows about dating and driving and high school and struggling with your parents not understanding you. All of that's new. And again, shows are geared towards those teenage issues and people watching. New dance halls, diners, movie theaters, drive-in movies, car culture, new cars that are appealing to kids, to teenagers specifically. Even clothing styles like certain types of jeans and leather jackets and shoes and the flouncy poodle skirts. Those were made for teenagers. Now, how are they getting all this stuff? Either mom and dad are buying it for them, or teenagers may have a part-time job. Remember, they're not working full-time, but maybe they're working part-time. And they can afford some of these things. So they can go to the movies or buy these clothes or buy these albums that are coming out from these different music artists. So not only do we have new groups within society, but we also have, again, new culture that's being sparked from all of these new age groups that are being recognized for the first time, largely in the United States. So if, again, you guys have questions on any of this, make sure that you contact me. We're going to do a little bit more with culture this week, and so we're going to kind of build on some of these ideas, but make sure that you're washing your hands, and I hopefully will see you guys soon. Have a good one.